Okay, so we'll start with the 444. When a New Zealand citizen arrives at the airport in Australia, they don't need to apply for a visa beforehand. They're granted on arrival a subclass 444 special category visa on the basis of their New Zealand passport. With this, Kiwis can live, work, and study in Australia. They get pretty much the rights of a permanent resident. However, they're not quite a permanent resident. For their family members will need to apply for a subclass 461 visa to travel to Australia or another visitor visa as a general rule. Once arrived on a 444, the 444 is treated as permanent residency for Australian citizenship purposes. That's the only purpose for which it's treated as permanent residency in the migration program. Therefore, once a New Zealand citizen lives in Australia for 4 years on the 444, they then become eligible to apply for what's called Australian citizenship by conferral. The basis of this is the residency of 4 years in Australia. And the benefits of Australian citizenship are that you become a fully fledged member of the Australian community and are able to vote, run for office, and you're no longer liable for visa cancellation if anything unfortunately goes wrong during your time in Australia. On this page, we have the basic eligibility requirements. As mentioned, it's 4 years and 12 months of permanent residency. The 444 is treated as permanent residency, so it's really just that 4-year requirement for New Zealand citizens. There are requirements regarding the amount of time spent overseas, so you kind of spent more than 12 months overseas in the 4 years immediately before you apply, and you also kind of spent 90 days in the 12 months immediately before you apply. So you can think about it as lived in Australia for 4 years, haven't spent more than a year outside Australia total in those 4 years, and haven't spent more than 3 months outside Australia total in the 12 months before applying. There's also character requirements. If you don't have a criminal record, you will pass the character test. This only comes up if you have character concerns and something shows up on your AFP, or there is something from New Zealand that was on your criminal record. When you apply for citizenship by conferral, you'll complete a consent to exchange character information form. With this, there's information sharing between New Zealand and Australia regarding any criminal record. So it's better to be upfront and declare it if it's something that may be an issue for you, as the government will find out in the application process. Generally, it's an online application. You can do a paper application. However, it's slightly more costly and processes slower. Once approved, you'll need to attend a citizenship ceremony. These are organised by your local council, and then you'll attend and make the pledge and receive your certificate. The other step for people under 60 years old is a citizenship test or interview. It's not the most complicated test in the world. It largely looks at Australia's history and the democratic values which we share with New Zealanders. So most New Zealand citizens are able to pass the citizenship test when they sit it the first time. If you do have issues with the citizenship test, we have resources that can help study for the citizenship test. So this has all been for the New Zealand citizen themselves. Complications largely occur when the New Zealand citizen has other family members potentially living with them in New Zealand before they move to Australia who are not New Zealand citizens. For example, they may be a New Zealand resident but not have obtained their citizen at any time point. For people such as these, the main pathway is a subclass 461 family relationship visa. This is a 5-year visa. It is then renewable, and it's for partners and or children of New Zealand citizens. There are some technicalities regarding the 461 and general partner visas, which we'll get into later. But for the most part, it'll be a 461, 5 years validity, renewable. It's very similar to a partner visa application. So you need to show the relationship with your partner who's not a New Zealand citizen. It's rarer that would only be applying for a New Zealand child and not as part of a partner visa application, because the New Zealand child is likely a New Zealand citizen themselves in most cases. Alternatively, they would be the son or daughter of a New Zealand partner in the other cases. So it's very rare there would only be a child being included. The exception is eligible New Zealand citizens cannot do 461 visas. This is because they're treated as permanent residents. The key date is the 26th of February 2001. If someone was in Australia on 26th of February 2001 and they're a New Zealand citizen at the time, they will need to apply for a standard partner visa. So generally an 820 if they're inside Australia, or a subclass 309 if they're outside Australia. The reason for this is those people, and only those people, are treated as permanent residents for partner visa applications as well. Some of the key criteria for the 461 that may differ from partner visa options available to Australians is there's no prospective marriage visa application or visa option for New Zealand citizens. This means that instead of that option where it's good for long distance relationships that are relatively short in duration, or where you're not physically living together, that's a harder pathway for New Zealanders because they can't show an intention to enter into a married relationship. They need to show an existing either spousal relationship or de facto relationship that's a minimum of 12 months, or a de facto relationship with a that's registered in the relevant state or territory in Australia, from which a civil partnership certificate can be obtained and waive the 12-month requirement. So there's a slightly higher threshold normally for 461 applications, just since it's not an Australian citizen sponsoring the application. The subclass 820-801 partner visa is a long-term pathway for your family members if you're a New Zealand citizen. Once you obtain your Australian citizenship, you can sponsor someone for a subclass 820-801 partner visa, with the 820 being effectively provisional permanent residency and the 801 being permanent residency itself. And then eventually they can apply for Australian citizenship following the 801 partner visa being granted. This is the onshore pathway. Offshore is 309, which is the overseas equivalent to an 820, and then subclass 100 being permanent residency. The requirements from this are largely similar to those we've previously discussed. The major difference is that the 801 is permanent residency for your family member and generally your partner and their children. The other benefit, as mentioned, is they can then become citizens once they get their permanent residency through the partner visa program. This is a bit of an overview of the subclass 820 application process. So this is once you as a New Zealand citizen have now become an Australian citizen and your partner's doing their 820 application. They can stay in Australia while it's processed. They get work and study in Australia. They can access Medicare, and they can travel in and out of Australia once the visa is granted. Key things to remember for New Zealand citizens is that the 444, what you're granted on entry, it's not permanent residency in itself. It's permanent residency for citizenship application purposes. A common misconception is that New Zealand citizens automatically get permanent residency. That's not true. It's for citizenship applications that they're treated as permanent residents. The 189 New Zealand stream that previously existed prior to this citizenship pathway being implemented is now closed. New Zealand, if you had previously been considering doing the 189 New Zealand stream pre-2023, the better option is to enter on a 444 and apply for citizenship when you become eligible. Yeah, generally permanent residents have met skilled, employer-sponsored, or business visa criteria rather than just being a New Zealand citizen. Okay, common 461 mistakes. The most common is someone who's actually an eligible New Zealand citizen. So they're in Australia on the 26th of February 2001, even if it was just a holiday. If they're in Australia, then the 461 application would be invalid because the sponsor's not eligible, and they should do an 820 application instead, or a subclass 309 application. Another one is weak relationship evidence. The 461s are assessed slightly stricter from our experience, as we mentioned. So it's really important that the evidence is strong for a 461 application. For relationships that are not married, people may ignore the 12-month rule or not register their relationship to waive it. So an example would be if you're in a 6-month relationship with someone and you haven't registered the relationship, then the 461 application would likely be refused. The workaround is registering that relationship. Again, basic mistakes, missing police clearances or health checks, or not declaring information that then subsequently shows up on a police check. Status is generally okay. Going to update changes, yeah. Direct citizenship is the most common pathway, as we have discussed. This is another important thing to keep in mind if you're bringing family in, is if you're thinking about waiting for becoming a citizen to do an 820 801 or 309 100, generally you're better off doing the 461 in the short term. It has significantly faster processing times, and the cost is only $445 as the base application charge for a single applicant. This is in comparison to the subclass 820, where the cost is almost $9,500 when you apply. That's because it has the permanent residency pathway in the long run, but in the short term, the costs are more expensive for a subclass 820 partner visa. So if costs are a pressure, you might want to bring your partner in before doing your own citizenship. There are key takeaways. We'll open it up to any initial questions now. I could see a couple in the chat. Parent visas are usually a lot more complex than 461s, just because your parents not generally a member of your family unit, with family unit being your partner and children. In the long run, the parent visa, it would be better off becoming an Australian citizen first, then applying through the Australian parent visa pathways. There's no unique New Zealand parent visa pathway. Job offer for a New Zealand citizen and wants PR visa for being eligible for roles requiring it. Without being aware of what the job offer is, I'd communicate to the employer that you're a New Zealand citizen, because a lot of job offers, it will be a requirement of either being an Australian citizen, permanent resident, or New Zealand citizen. You can talk to your employer directly about the offer and whether they are able to employ a New Zealand citizen. I'm assuming it'll relate to a security clearance, most likely. So that's best discussed with your employer directly. For Ravi. How can you check if the New Zealand citizen has 444 status? There's a website online called Vivo, VEVO, with the Department of Home Affairs. If you put your passport details into there, you can then see which visa you're currently holding in Australia. It should show a 444 as being the visa that you hold. That is SCV status. We can't get into specific documents for a de facto relationship applicant. The department generally looks at 4 elements of de facto relationships. So they look at your commitment, the social recognition of your relationship, the financial sharing of responsibilities, and the sharing of household responsibilities for a de facto relationship. Think of a de facto relationship as being analogous to a married relationship, but without marriage. So they want to see that you're sharing all 4 of those things. If one criteria isn't being shared, then there's a risk in the application. If you can't sufficiently document or evidence or explain a criteria to the case officer, there's a risk that the de facto relationship will not be assessed positively. New Zealand citizen on a 444 already has a job. We'll go Elizabeth first. So children sponsoring a grandparent if they are in Australia via New Zealand citizenship. Generally, it would again need to be through an Australian pathway rather than the New Zealand citizenship as the basis for sponsorship, just because grandparents are unlikely to be considered part of that family unit. AusPR, it'll depend. Generally, they want New Zealanders applying for Australian citizenship as a pathway to more permanent residency rather than the 444. The invitations for permanent residency under the old system, it is now quite hard to get. As we had on an earlier slide, they closed down following the introduction of the pathway, some of the old pathways to permanent residency for New Zealand citizens. Just have the date, it was in around June 2023. So a lot of the old pathways to permanent residency that were more short-term in nature for New Zealand citizens have now been closed because they want New Zealand citizens going through that citizenship pathway. Does that help clarify, Ravi? Yes, a copy of the slides can be made available. EJ would be able to send those out. Angel, you're welcome to just unmute and ask your question as well if that's easier. Yes, Ravi, you can also explore employer nominated 186 direct entry if the issue is, the employer. There is no special grandparent visa. It is under the parent visa pathways, Elizabeth. In that circumstance, Angel, it'll depend on the length of relationship. So the 820-801, all 820-801s are technically joint applications for an 820-801 when lodged. If it's assessed as a long-term de facto or married relationship, then the 801 may be granted as a double grant with the 820 and 801 both coming through. So in terms of how that practically looks, you'll receive an email with that 820 grant, and then 2 minutes later, you'll receive an email with that 801 grant. As you mentioned, it's late in the 461, and the partner's already an Australian citizen when you're applying for the 820, 801. In that case, it would likely be a long-term relationship, being near the 5-year mark, plus however long before the 461 was applied for, in which case the 801 would likely be granted at the first instance with that double grant, as long as you can show the evidence for a long-term relationship. No, Elizabeth, there are a range of different parent visas to Australia. So there are onshore and offshore parent visas. There are also contributory parent visas. So I'd recommend looking into the parent visa program as a whole. We will likely have a separate webinar that covers parent visas in detail and in much more detail and expand on it. The parent visa system. That 820 is a partner visa application. So it's not a parent visa. It's not a family relationship application like the 461. It's a partner visa basis. Parent visas are a separate category to partner visas or family relation visas requiring members of a family unit. The department has a distinction between family members and family units. Are there any further questions? Or EJ, did you have anything further you want to add?
I think that's all the questions we have. If you have further personal questions, more complicated ones, just feel free to scan the QR code or contact us via email, and we can book you that free consultation with Patrick. And regarding the webinar presentation slides and the recording, we will be sending those as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's webinar.
Anyways, thank you very much all for attending, and we hope that you're able to gain some benefit from the webinar.